What's up, YouTube? This is John Helm with Helm Sharpen Smithy, back with another knife making video. I've made a lot of videos where I made a knife and you could see the way that I did it, but I've never made a video going through my knife making process and explaining it to you, so that's what I'm going to do today. Of course, the process is a little bit different depending on what type of knife I'm making, so more specifically this episode will be my knife making process for a stock removal full tang knife. Now the knives I'm making today have stacked scales on them, so I went ahead and included all the steps that I used to make those scales as well. But if you're just using wooden scales or prefabricated scales or something, of course you could just skip all that and stick them directly onto your knife. And in time I'd like to make one of these step-by-step videos for various styles of knives with different handle construction and whatnot. So if you learned something from this video today or you just enjoy watching, be sure to subscribe and hit the notifications button so you can see when I come out with those videos later. And with no further ado, let's make a knife. Of course, the first step to building anything is you have to design it. So here I just sketched the knife out on a piece of Xerox paper. This is a Gyuto style knife with sort of a westernized handle on it. And then I cut that out with an X-Acto knife to make a template so that I can trace it onto my steel. This is some 80 CRV steel. It's kind of my new favorite mono steel to work with. So I just traced those on. It doesn't have to be super precise because I generally change the design of knives in the middle of the build. A lot of times things can show up on paper and they look great, and then when you have it in your hand, it's just not right, and you have to make some adjustments. So I do that quite a bit. All throughout this process, you'll see that I follow a basic progression where I rough cut something using a tool that removes material very quickly, and then I gradually work up to finer and finer tools until I get the shape refined and exactly the way I want it to be. Just like you would when you're hand sanding, you think of it that way. So here I have a 7.5 inch angle grinder, and I'm just cutting off all the excess chunks. I do have a tendency to spend a little bit too much time with the angle grinder and even with the 2x72, especially when I'm profiling, trying to get everything perfect, because I'm not actually going to finish the profile on my knife until I have the handle scales glued on, because you're going to have to grind away some of the steel in order to get a nice flush junction between the scales and the tang. So there's no need for me to spend all this time getting it perfect. I don't know, I zone out. So here I am on the 2x72, grinding that down to the scribe lines. Of course, I try to grind it down to where I can't see the marker at all if I'm trying to get it real close, which I shouldn't be doing at this point, but I am. Bad habits die hard. Bad habits. Old habits die hard. Anyway. And there we are. Two snazzy looking knives. Now I'm going to mark out some spots for my pins to go in. And I initially designed this with a bolster, but I decided to just go with a stacked scale, so I changed those up. You know, a lot of people get really precise when they're marking their pinholes, and I don't. I just eyeball it. If it looks right, it's right. So I just put it where it looks right. Drill my holes. I'm chamfering them here with a 1/2 inch drill bit, and I'm drilling some little holes for the epoxy to flow through, just to try to keep the scales together a little bit better. And once those holes are drilled, it is time to light the forge and heat treat these suckers. I love this propane forge. It is so much easier to use than the coal forge that I had before. Just heating up my oil there with a piece of hot rebar. Yeah, but getting an even heat on a blade like this that is, I don't know, I think it's about 7.5, 8 inches long, it was just a breeze using the propane forge. And in the coal forge, it takes a ton of skill, a ton of patience. It's just a nightmare. They came out nice and hard, but there was just a slight warp in each of them, so I clamped them onto a piece of angle iron to straighten them out before I threw them in the oven to temper for 2 hours and 2 cycles at 400 degrees Fahrenheit. And while those are tempering, I go over to the miter saw. Using a stop block, I make a bunch of slices of wood for my stacked scales. Stop block makes sure that they're all the same height. believe that's African blackwood, ironwood, and some stabilized European beech wood. Slap some sandpaper on a piece of granite, and it's time to flatten these suckers out so I can glue them together. This is a pretty tedious part. Anytime you see me pull out sandpaper, I'm about to do something that sucks really bad. And this is absolutely not an exception to that rule. But the key to this is don't put too much pressure. Don't put pressure in the same spot all the time, and just take your time, be patient with it. Here I'm cutting down some, that's black linen micarta liner material. I'm using that as spacers on the stack scale itself, and then I'll use some more as a Tang liner. This stuff was marketed as G10. I don't know what the hell it is though. It's not G10. It feels like the fabric that money is made out of, but it's really thick. Anyway, I really like it because it's flexible and it has just a little bit of give to it, so you don't have to flatten it. You can just stick it on there. Makes it really easy to work with. And we are ready for our first glue up. So it turns out that my work surface isn't flat, so while I was stacking these up, they kept wanting to slide over on me. It was kind of a pain to hold it and do the whole thing one-handed, but it worked out. I got it to happen. And then just a little bit of clamping pressure, let them dry, and now I'm trimming them down on the bandsaw. I usually do this on the table saw. I decided to try it on the bandsaw, and quite frankly, the table saw was a better option. So now that these are out of the temper, I'm just going to knock off the scale, and I'm going to reduce the width of the spine quite a bit here. I don't like to quench with it ground all the way down, just because you can pretty much guarantee you're going to have a bad warp if that happens. And this is the second design change. I decided to go ahead and do a chisel grind on these rather than a regular double-sided bevel, which sort of changed the style from being more like a santoku to being more like a gyuto. Gyuto? I don't know, I'm probably saying both of them wrong. Anyway, here I am grinding in that chisel grind. It is simpler than putting a bevel on either side, but it is not necessarily easier. I actually tend to have more trouble with chisel grinds than I do more traditional grinds, but I just love the way that they cut. I think that they're outstanding for the kitchen, so I like to make a lot of those. And the customers really appreciate it too. Most of them haven't even seen a knife like that. So now I'm on to hand sanding, which is, of course, outstanding, everybody's favorite. The large flat surfaces on a chisel ground knife can be challenging to get an even finish on when you're hand sanding. So again, just take your time, be patient, don't get in a rush, because that's how you screw things up. And I'm going to etch these. So first I spray them with a little bit of WD-40 degreaser. It is outstanding. It works way better than acetone for getting the oil off of your blade prior to an etch, in my opinion. And then drop those in the ferric, and while they're etching, I'm just going to flatten off these scales so that I can glue them down to the liner. The etch is done, so I'm neutralizing a little sodium bicarbonate. Take a minute to pet my dog. Her name is Baby. She came in there wanting some love. And now I'm cutting some Tang liner material. This is, again, that black linen micarta. And it's real shiny and slick, so I rough it up, just try to give the epoxy something to hang on to. And then I clean it all up with acetone, make sure there's no excess of oils on there that would stop the adhesive from bonding. And it is time for yet another glue up. The big thing about making stack scales or scales with Tang liners is just you have to do like 3 or 4 glue ups per knife, and it can really add to the amount of time that it takes. But you know, I think it's definitely worth it because aesthetically they're beautiful. So those are all dry. I'm going to take the clamps off and trim off the excess on the bandsaw. And once again, I'm going to flatten them. The Tang liner materials are very seldom actually flat. They look really flat when you get it, but they almost never are. So I'll always take the extra time, go over there and flatten them again. And then I'll put them in a vise and clamp down the Tang to it so I can drill some holes for my pins. Get a little center punch. And we're drilling. Just tracing out the Tang here so that I can trim the scales down to size. But before I do that, I'm going to drill some concentric shoulders into those pinholes. I'm doing this because I'm using Corby fasteners instead of regular pins. If you're not using Corby fasteners, you don't have to worry about that. Here I'm just trimming these to shape on the bandsaw, which I thought would be fast. I usually do it by hand or with a jigsaw, and it was not any faster. It probably was a little bit easier though. And then I grind it down a little bit closer to shape on the belt grinder. You don't necessarily have to do that. I just don't like to have a lot of wood hanging off the sides of the Tang after I glue up, because I like to know exactly where I'm going to hit that metal when I'm removing the excess scale material. And here I just pin the two scales together so that I can evenly grind the top of the scales. Probably should have cut that off in retrospect, but I ground it off. I had an old beater belt on there anyway, which the ironwood clogs up your belts really bad. The ebony does it a little bit, but not nearly as bad as the ironwood. Ironwood will waste a belt faster than steel will. And now I sand those up. I think I brought them up to a 1500 grit finish. And it is time for our final glue up. Gluing up with Corby fasteners is really convenient because you don't have to screw around with clamps or anything like that. You just put them in, tighten them down, wipe off your blade, and hey, you're done, man. And after they're dry, I will take them over to the 2x72 and very slowly grind off the pin sticking out from the handle. They get real hot real fast, and it's easy to ruin your epoxy bond by heating them up too much, so take it slow. And then I just kind of smooth everything out before I take it and start grinding off the profile. So I start just by trying to get all the wood off of the edge so that we have a nice clean transition between the Tang and the scale. And then after that's done, I'll go ahead and start feeling it in my hand, looking at it, deciding where I need to change the profile, and I'll just continuously do that until it gets the way I like it. You can see here I'm working up to a little bit higher grit finish all along the spine. I usually take it up to 220 just to kind of set the foundations of a nice surface finish. Minimize the amount of work I have to do with hand sanding later. And then for these inside corners that I can't get to on my 2x72, I use these little flap wheels on a Dremel. It's an outstanding product. I love these things. I'm going to make a video in the future of the shop products that I like the most that I don't see a lot of other people using. And this is definitely going to be top 3 on that list. So I'll tell you where to get them in that video. And after I polish up the Tang a little bit, I start shaping the handle by hand with some files. I wanted to maintain that octagonal look that Japanese knife handles generally have. But when I took it straight to an octagon, it still felt really blocky and uncomfortable. So I wound up keeping the sharp lines around on the face of the scale, I guess you could call it, and then rounding off the part leading into the Tang, and that wound up being very comfortable. This particular handle shape, if it's done well, it is an outstanding shape for a kitchen knife because you have a great place to put your fingers if you're holding the handle or if you're pinching the blade, but it has to be done just right. So I had to take a lot of time, be very, very careful with how much I took off the sides and the corners of this so that you can get a good firm grip and not have any hot spots or weird lumps poking into your hand while you're using it. It definitely took quite a bit of trial and error before I got to the point where I was making these sort of reverse finger notch handles that felt really good. Put a little white rouge on my buffing wheel, and these shined right up. Really happy with how the wood polished up. Got a big old brick of White Rouge for like $20, and I don't think I'll ever run out in this lifetime. Finally, it's time to sharpen. Now, chisel grind knives I like to sharpen by putting on a micro bevel on some stones because they're not as aggressive. Other knives I'll sharpen on the belt, but I don't know. I guess it just kind of depends on how I'm feeling that day. If I feel like taking a risk or not, because remember, I don't have a VFD on my grinder. I can't slow it down. So sharpening it can be a little bit scary. And here I'm just stropping off those edges on the buffing wheel. It's a great way to strop, especially if you don't want to spend forever stropping them on a piece of leather with buffing compound on it. And put a finish on the handle. It's just a little boiled linseed oil. And there we are. They came out beautifully. They are razor sharp. The handles feel great and they look outstanding. I love these handles. Kind of wish my kitchen knives had handles like that on them. I'm really happy with these. My kitchen knives keep getting better and better. Keep running into less issues with it. And that's always a good thing. Hopefully you can take some of the different things that I do in my knife making process and add them to your own. And ideally help improve it. I mean, I'm not saying mine's better than yours. Jeez, relax. It's always nice to see other knife makers' knife making processes, just to see what they do the same as you, what they do different, give you new ideas. Maybe you'll run into an issue, son of a bitch. And that is a wrap. If you enjoyed the episode, please don't forget to comment, like, subscribe, and hit the notifications bell so you can see when I come out with new videos in the future. And until next time, y'all have a good one.